Hello, and welcome to Dentons Dialogue, U.S. Policy Perspectives, Congressional Conversation featuring U.S. Budget Committee Chairman John Yarmuth. We have a wonderful program in store for you today. Before we begin, we have a few housekeeping items. Please note that today's webinar will be recorded and circulated to all participants after the event. For the benefit of all participants, guest lines have been muted. Should you have any questions that you would like to submit, you may submit them through the chat box at the bottom of your screen. If we cannot address your question during the call, we will follow up with you after the presentation. For more detailed or personal questions, please contact your local Dentons lawyer or send an email to David Tandy at david.tandy@dentons.com. This email address is available on the slide below. With that, please let me introduce our first speaker, Dentons Counsel David Tandy. Over to you, David.
All right, thank you, Maddie, and good afternoon to everyone. Again, my name is David Tandy. I'm in the Louisville, Kentucky office of Dentons. I practice in the Public Policy and Local Government Solutions practice groups, and will serve as your moderator today, along with my colleague, Sander Lurie, who is in our Washington, D.C. office and is also a part of our public policy practice group. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that we here in Dentons want you to know that we're here to help you with whatever challenges you may be facing within your organization by keeping you informed on the latest developments taking place in Washington, D.C. or in state capitals or city halls all across our country. We encourage you to tap into our collective knowledge and skill set that's found in our international team of lawyers and professionals who are here and eager to help you develop effective solutions to meet and conquer the challenges you face in running your organizations and in your respective communities. We encourage you to go to dentons.com to find the right attorney or professional to help you and to check out up-to-date information that we have on the different pressing issues of the day. And so with all that being said and the commercial being out of the way, let's get down to the business at hand and having a conversation with our very special guest, the Honorable John Yarmuth. Chairman Yarmuth is the House of representative for the 3rd Congressional District here in Kentucky, and he serves as chairman of the House Budget Committee. He's now in his 8th term in Congress and has been the chairman of the Budget Committee since 2019. Chairman Yarmuth has been recognized for his work to improve education, expand access to affordable health care, and to revitalize manufacturing in Louisville, Kentucky, and beyond. Born and raised here in Louisville, Kentucky, Chairman Yarmuth and his wife, Kathy, have one son, Aaron, who is the editor of the Leo Weekly, which is a publication that was founded by Chairman Yarmuth in 1990. And most importantly, he and Kathy are the proud grandparents of their grandchild, JD. And so with that being said, Chairman Yarmuth, we thank you for taking time being with us this afternoon and sharing your insights with us. I want to start off by just turning the floor over to you and asking you to give us your thoughts and insights on what it is that you want to accomplish as chairman of the House Budget Committee here in the 117th Congress.
Well, first of all, David, thank you very much. It's good to be with you. Thanks to Dentons for putting this on, and hello to everyone who's attending the program. I'm here in Washington. We are hard at work, and it's really been a rather uneventful month this year. We got a slow start, but I'm still having a hard time processing everything that's gone on since we were sworn in to the new Congress on January 3rd. And of course, the attacks on the Capitol took place on the 6th. We've impeached the president for the 2nd time. We now are voting today to take the committee seats away from a Republican freshman member. And next week, the trial in the Senate of the impeachment will take place. So there's a lot going on. And of course, we have a new president who has been as active, I think, as any president has ever been in their first term of office. And we can talk about that after a while. Things have changed here in Washington. I don't think there's any question about that. We have had, I've always, during my terms in Congress, I've always reassured my constituents and friends that we don't work in a hostile work environment, that we all get along, that a lot of what we do that you see on television is political theater, but we're actually very cordial. That really has changed in the last month, and it's a shame, but I suspect that was inevitable given what had occurred and given the fact that a large number of our colleagues have been essentially advancing arguments that have led to the attacks on the Capitol and I think on our very democracy. I'm going to try to do the best I can to remain nonpartisan in this program, but it probably will be impossible to do totally. So I apologize for that. So this is a particularly busy time for the Budget Committee. As you may know, we have been asked by President Biden to do everything we can to push through his American Rescue Plan, which is the COVID relief plan, $1.9 trillion to cover a variety of things. And one of the ways we can do that with the very, very slim majority we have in the Senate, which is actually no majority at all. We just happen to have the vice president sitting as president of the Senate who can break ties. So we have a 50-50 split in the Senate, a slightly larger margin in the House, but not very large. And so one of the ways we can actually get things passed is through a process called reconciliation. And if you've left a 1 acre plot of land uncut for 2 years, that's how many weeds are involved in the reconciliation process. And we could spend the entire program and more describing the reconciliation process. But basically, it was a way that was created back in 1974 when the Budget Committee was created to allow votes to pass with a simple majority in the Senate. In other words, not being subject to a filibuster if they are aimed at deficit reduction. That's the way that was the intent of the creation of the reconciliation process. But the law did not say you couldn't increase the deficit. It just said you couldn't increase the deficit outside of a 10-year budget window. So right now, one of our options to get what we want passed, what the president wants passed, is to use this reconciliation process. That started yesterday, it went through the Budget Committee. On the floor of the House, we passed it yesterday. And the Senate is doing the same thing as we speak. And once we get this initial phase, I'm not going to go into through too many weeds, but there are two phases to this. One is what we've just done and will do today. And the second one is actual legislation, which implements the spending for the priorities that the Biden administration is requesting. And then once the House passes that just by a simple majority, as always, the Senate can pass it with a simple majority. And meanwhile, there are bipartisan negotiations going on, the president and the Republicans and the Democrats, to try and get bipartisan agreement on a similar package, but one that would be bipartisan. So the way we're describing it is we're on a parallel tracks, that there are bipartisan negotiations going on and we're going through a reconciliation. We would prefer the bipartisan approach. It can be done actually in much less complicated fashion, and we can get it done fast. The reason there's this sense of urgency is a number of reasons. One is we've got to get a handle on the vaccines and to stop the virus, because everything in terms of the economy and society depends on that. So a great deal of the emphasis of the program is vaccination, testing and tracing, and that type of effort. Then there's money to states and local government. There's an extension of unemployment insurance. And this is really important because we passed a bill in December, but it only extended the unemployment supplement till March 14th. And then several other provisions of that legislation expire at the end of March. So that's why there's a sense of urgency. Plus, we want to act as quickly as possible to get a handle on the virus so that we can return to a relatively normal country as soon as possible. And meanwhile, providing help for the people who need it. So that's the primary emphasis of the Congress right now. That's our top priority. And while we're working on other legislation, that's number one. That's job number one. When you ask what my priorities are for the Budget Committee, of course, immediately that's it. It's important because we have the opportunity to do another reconciliation bill in the spring. This was for fiscal year 21, which we're already in the middle of. We can do another one for fiscal 22, so we can use that procedure to get something else done that might not be able to get 60 votes in the Senate. But so I'm going to be focused on those for the first half of the year, and then probably again in the spring of 2022, because we'll have an opportunity to do a third reconciliation bill. And I'll be ready for that. But one of the things that I started in the last Congress, and one which I will continue to talk about this year and use the committee to have the dialogue, is that we need to get a much better understanding of the debt, what it means, whether we should worry about it or not, and how the money system really works in this country. And one of the things that I've realized, and I've been on the committee now since my second term, is that we have been operating as an economy under a certain set of assumptions for the last 50, 60 years. And that is that the more debt we accrue, interest rates go up, inflation goes up, and the dollar weakens, and that's bad for everybody. In fact, we have dramatically increased the national debt. We've more than doubled the national debt just in the last 12 years. And there has been no inflation in the economy. Interest rates are at historic lows, and the dollar is basically in the range vis-a-vis other currencies that it's always been. And so a lot of economists are looking at things now and saying, maybe our assumptions about the way the economy works are not right. And as a matter of fact, we had a committee hearing last year called Does Debt Matter? And we had economists from across the political spectrum who basically all said, no, it doesn't matter. And you may know there's a book out now called The Deficit Myth by a professor named Stephanie Kelton, and it deals with what's called modern monetary theory. And her theory is that modern monetary theory is that when you have a sovereign currency, as we do, so we issue currency as a federal government, we borrow in our own currency, and we spend our own currency. In that situation, you basically can issue as much currency as you want, as much money as you want, and spend as much as you want, with one main constraint, and that is you can only put as much money into the economy as the economy can absorb without having significant inflation. And again, when I spoke to her at one time, I said, so would you say that over the last 12 years, we basically have validated modern monetary theory? And she said, I would say over the last 30 years, we've validated it. So one of the things that I want to use the Budget Committee for is to actually talk more about this. And because most Americans, understandably, think about debt in their own context. So they think about debt as it relates to their household or their business or their local government or their state government. None of those entities are like the federal government. And the analogy she uses is, it's like the banker in Monopoly. The banker in the Monopoly, every time you pass go or the banker gives you $200. The banker's constantly putting money into the system. And as a matter of fact, in the rules of Monopoly, it says if you actually run out of the money that's in the game, you write it out on a piece of paper. You keep creating more money. And so I think, again, it's partially educational, but it's partially to try and get a better understanding of what the way our economy works and our money system works. Because unless we have that, we're going to be playing games with all sorts of things that maybe we don't need to. I also am using the committee as last year and last Congress, and I will again this Congress to a certain extent, to talk about certain issues and how they impact the budget. Again, so when we're making policy, we have a frame of reference financially. So we've had hearings on immigration reform, on artificial intelligence, on climate change, not dealing with the substance of those issues, but essentially saying, what happens to the national budget when we do certain things in these areas, understanding how they affect the economy and the budget. And so we don't have a lot of legislative authority in the budget committee, but we have a lot of oversight authority because basically almost anything affects the budget. And that's what I plan to do with the committee this Congress. Long answer, but.
No, that's great. Thank you so much again, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to ask a couple of questions that I think are on people's mind about, let's call it Reconciliation 1, the Biden Rescue Plan.
Yes.
You expect that to be on the president's desk right around that March 14th deadline. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, the schedule that we're working on has it on the House floor the 1st or 2nd of March, and then it would go to the Senate. But what we're doing is we're doing something called pre-conferencing, so that we're working to make sure that the Senate bill and the House bill that are ultimately considered are the same piece of legislation. So unless it gets changed on the floor in the Senate, that they don't need to spend hours and hours and hours in the Senate working on it. So it could be a little sooner than the 14th. We hope it is, but our absolute drop dead date is the 14th.
And further on the Reconciliation 1, are there any components of the Biden plan that might be in some kind of jeopardy or need revising perhaps the legislative process?
Yeah, so this is another one of the patches of weeds we'll get into. There's something called the Byrd Rule, which was named after Robert Byrd. And it basically says that you can only use reconciliation for budgetary matters. So you can't make policy in a budget reconciliation. And it gets more complicated from there, but that's the general policy. So there are two things specifically in the president's plan that are at least problematic in terms of the Byrd Rule. One is raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. The other one's paid sick leave for Americans. And both of those we think can ultimately clear the Byrd Rule, but they're going to have to be drafted in a certain way, and they still might not. So the Byrd Rule says basically that the budgetary change, in order to clear the Byrd Rule, the budgetary change has to be more than incidental. Now, incidental does not mean inconsequential. So it means that if you have, let's say, obviously the $15 an hour minimum wage, it has a certain impact on the federal budget, but the vast majority of the impact is on the private sector, because most everybody who works for the federal government already makes $15 an hour. The estimate is it's somewhere around $6 or $7 billion it would actually cost the federal government to do that. But the question is whether the Senate parliamentarian would decide that that is incidental and that we're really making policy for the country, or whether that's a significant enough change for the budget that it's more than incidental. So while the rules are written, they're all subject to the interpretation of the parliamentarian in the Senate, and she can decide whatever she decides. Then we have the option of either taking that provision out or trying to overrule the parliamentarian. Now, if we have a 50-50 vote, the vice president breaks the tie. The vice president can then overrule the parliamentarian and then to basically rule her out of order. And then there would be a vote to overrule the decision of the chair, which in this case would be the vice president, which would be a simple majority vote. So that's kind of a heavy-handed way to get things past the Byrd Rule, but right. That's kind of what we're looking at with there may be 2 or 3 other minor provisions in the plan. The major ones, though, are pretty cut and dried. All of the health-related, the vaccines, testing and tracing, pure budgetary impact, aid to state and local government, aid to schools to help them open safely, extension of unemployment benefits, the individual check for people making up to a certain amount of money. Those are all clear bird rules, and that's the vast majority of the money that we're talking of the 1.9 trillion.
I see.
Right.
So, Chairman, when we're you about the so I guess we'll call it for everybody to be on the same page, that reconciliation 1 bill, and we're talking about the Biden Harris COVID relief package. Can we go a little bit deeper in talking about about the aid to state and local government? There's a lot of local city leaders on this call. There are a lot of quasi-governmental entities, like give you an example, like in Louisville, the Waterfront Development Corporation, for example, and you have your entities like your MSDs and your water companies and your parks, the parking authorities and things of that nature. When we're talking about funding for state and local governments, are there funds available for those entities, or can you kind of walk us through what we would be looking at going forward with this package?
Sure. So in the CARES Act, which was the package that we passed last April, March or April, which had a significant amount of money for state and local governments, the state and local governments could only use those funds for costs related to the virus. It was very restrictive. So most of them used the funds for first responders and so forth. We recognized later that was a problem. In the subsequent legislation that we passed called the HEROES Act, which was in May, which never passed the Senate, we corrected that and basically provided a lot more flexibility. So under this bill, which I think has about $310 billion in it for state and local governments, it's 300 plus. The money would go to the states on a formula basis, and then they could use it however they wanted to. The idea now is not just to cover the costs of the virus and dealing with the virus, but to deal with the loss of revenue as well. So that's why there's virtually total flexibility with the money that would come down through this bill.
I see. So now, is that additional dollars, or is that just providing language that would free up the money that was passed in the CARES Act to now be used?
No, it's additional. It's additional money.
Okay.
And that's actually been one of the arguments that Republicans have raised. They've said, well, there was a lot of money that was put out in the CARES Act that was never spent. And I, for instance, talked to Governor Beshear about that. And he said, yeah, a lot of it hasn't been spent, but it's been allocated. There are plans for it. And that's, so this is new money.
Okay. Sander?
There are lots of folks on this Zoom also who are interested in things like a major boost in infrastructure and climate legislation and broadband. And I assume that those would sort of the economic parts of a reconciliation too. Is that your sense about that?
Right. So we will do a budget resolution in the spring for fiscal 22 that will include reconciliation instructions. It's anticipated that one of the things that will be prioritized in that bill is infrastructure spending. But again, if we are able to reach a bipartisan agreement with Republicans on infrastructure, which historically we've been able to do, then we wouldn't use it for reconciliation for that. We'd use it for something else. Climate change is definitely something that we plan to use reconciliation for, because there's not as much likelihood that we'll get buy-in from Republicans on those initiatives. Hope's eternal, spring's eternal, and we're certainly not going to give up before we try on that. But it's more likely that climate will be used in there than infrastructure, but it's probable that both of them will end up being used for infrastructure, used in a reconciliation.
Right.
I've said that this is going to be the kitchen sink reconciliation bill. Everybody who wants something done that's the least bit controversial is going to want to get that in the next reconciliation package. And of course, that raises the likelihood that there'll be numerous bird rule challenges. And so, that people want to use it for immigration reform as well. And immigration reform, which I think is absolutely critical for the country. A lot of it, I think, is pretty clearly okay with the bird rule. Some of it's not. So we're going to have to make that determination as well. Immigration reform actually is much closer to a positive impact on the budget than it is a negative one.
As are some of the pension provisions as well.
Some of the pensions, yes,
money.
right.
Yeah. David?
Yeah. So in that second, there's 2 points here, I guess. So one, just as a way of kind of understanding how reconciliation works for the lay person. Essentially, like, reconciliation is used in Congress. It's almost like your, basically it's like the trump card that you would drop down if everything is deadlocked, but you still have a majority. You would use reconciliation to get something through, but you're limited as to the numbers of times that you can use reconciliation in a particular Congress. Is that the way?
Right. That's right. So the law says we can do one reconciliation bill for spending and one reconciliation bill for revenues, and then one reconciliation bill for the debt limit.
Okay.
So there are actually 3 opportunities in each fiscal year. The subtlety there is that virtually everything you do has both spending and revenue implications. So generally, we end up being able to do one reconciliation bill per fiscal year, plus the debt limit, which can only be used for the debt limit to raise the statutory debt limit, which we're going to have to do this summer. And so generally it's every fiscal year. You can do, literally you can do 2, but it ends up being 1. And just to give a little history, the last time reconciliation was done was in 2007. Well, the Republicans did it in 2017 and 2018. In 2018, they used it to try and repeal the Affordable Care Act. That was the vote that John McCain was the difference in the middle of the night. And then they also used it in 2017 to pass their tax cuts. So they did that without, again, with a simple majority.
And just as you are likely to be responding to critics about this is not a bipartisan process, I think it may be helpful to remind folks that the attempt to repeal the Affordable Care Act and the tax cut were not bipartisan.
Right, 100% partisan. And to be perfectly fair and balanced, we used reconciliation to pass the Affordable Care Act in 2010 because when we had initially passed it, we had 60 votes, and then Ted Kennedy died, and the Democrats lost that seat, and that gave us 59, so we couldn't pass the Affordable Care Act without reconciliation. Right. Those are the last 3 times that they've been used. I think the Republicans tried it in 2014 for something, but they didn't get anything for it. Didn't work.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, one of the questions we had from one of our participants, and I'll take this opportunity to remind everyone who's watching the webinar, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask the chairman, please submit those in the chat box down at the bottom of your screen. And we'll do our best to try to get those questions answered for you. But Mr. Chairman, one of the questions that were asked when we're talking about reconciliation, particularly in our second reconciliation that you would take up, would you also use what's called the Gephardt rule to automatically increase the debt ceiling with that in that reconciliation package?
I haven't heard any discussion on that yet. We're going to have to raise the debt limit this summer when in 2019, we had a bipartisan agreement on the budget for 2 years, the top line budget, and we extended the debt limit for those basically into July of this year. So depending on what we do in July with reconciliation with that debt limit, we might extend it for 2 years. So we might not have to do it again this spring, but I would say we won't do it this spring as part of the bill because we'll be able to do it by reconciliation in July or whenever we want to.
We had a question.
Personally, I'm totally for repealing the debt limit. It makes no sense. We've raised it I think about 90 times now since it was actually instituted. And other than Denmark, we're the only industrialized nation in the world that has one.
We did get a question from somebody from Louisville, I think, who asked about the second reconciliation bill. Would it have some measures to kind of fight income and economic inequality? Like I think the person mentioned opportunity zones and things like that. Do you expect that kind of economic development type of tools to be included in the second bill?
I wouldn't be surprised. Again, I think there will be dozens of things that end up in there, and of course, that is a top priority of the Democratic caucus and a high priority of the administration to do something about inequity in society and poverty. And so I suspect there'll be a number of initiatives as part of that.
Okay. He also asked back home how the vaccine distribution is going in your district and state, and is it getting to communities of color as broadly as in other areas? No, a variety of factors. One is that there still is a considerable amount of resistance in the African American communities. Black leaders throughout the community are working on that. But our biggest problem right now is not the logistics of distribution, it's the supply. And the mayors told me that, the governors told me that. We can administer far more vaccines than we have supply of it. That's changing. We just upped by 16 or 17% the amount of supply that's being delivered. One of the key problems we've had, and this relates to all segments of society, but particularly to minority citizens, is up until very recently, we were getting 1 or 2 days notice as to how much vaccine we were getting. So it made it very difficult to schedule. And so when you have people who are less savvy with the internet and have less access to the internet, it was very difficult to schedule. Now they're getting 3 weeks notice. So it should be much easier for those who are, again, not as technically savvy as others if you didn't have family to help you, then a lot of times you fell through the cracks. It was difficult to get scheduled. So a lot of that is going to be changed. I think improved because of the advance notice that the city and state are getting about when they can promise vaccine to the people. So it should get a lot better for everybody.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I got a question here with regard to the opportunity zone legislation. And the question is, do you think that the opportunity zone legislation will survive and make it to President Biden's overall agenda in terms of, and again, this is kind of getting toward the need to continue to help strengthen and bring about social and economic equality and equity within the Black and brown communities, not only just in Louisville, but across the country? Yeah,
I think there's a good chance of that. There's a fair amount of bipartisan support for opportunity zones. I think Rand Paul's actually a pretty strong supporter of those. The problem that we've seen with them is though that they've tended to be manipulated so that they're used by the people who don't need them. And so I think that's one of the things that the people who are developing those programs on our side are really concerned about, is to make sure that these really go to the communities that need them and not to wealthy developers and who use the loopholes to take advantage of them. It's not been designed for them, but they've had a disproportionate benefit from those that have been tried.
Okay.
Got another question of mine, David.
Go ahead.
This just more to show you that when you're budget chair, everything affects the budget. But
Right.
we have a question on the possibility of the Safe Banking Act for cannabis. Could that catch a ride in the second reconciliation?
It definitely could. That passed the House where there's overwhelming support for it among the Democratic caucus. Chuck Schumer just yesterday or the day before talked about how he's going to introduce a package to change the laws with cannabis so that we'll essentially decriminalize it at the federal level, let states do whatever they want without any worry. And I think the banking piece of it would be part of that. But I think there's a good chance that if we can't do it on a bipartisan basis, that would be in the reconciliation bill.
Mr. Chairman, one of the topics of discussion, I guess this is more of the inside baseball that was taking place within Congress, had dealt with the restoration of earmarks, the ability for members of Congress to write specific projects, into legislation for federal funding. I wonder, give us your thoughts. Do you think that's something that would come back to Congress to be utilized both in the House and the Senate, or where do you see that standing?
I think there is a better than 50-50 chance that they're going to return. I think there's a significantly good chance they'll return. Both Republicans and Democrats want them. There was an unfortunate stigma placed on earmarks way back with the Bridge to Nowhere and some other things. But before John Boehner ended them in, I think, 2010, there was we had put in a lot of reforms to make them more transparent, to make sure that people didn't use them for their personal benefits. So we had to, any earmark we submitted, we had to sign an affidavit that we had no financial interest or derive no financial benefit from it. We put a ban on them going to for-profit entities, so they only go to governments and nonprofits now, or that was the last iteration. And so I think the safeguards are in place to make sure that they're not abused. And the way we look at it, and this is the argument that I and many on both sides of the aisle have used, is that's our constitutional responsibility. Our constitutional responsibility is to determine where the money is spent, from the federal government is spent. And there are two options. We can turn it all over to bureaucracy, or we as the people who should know our districts and our states better than bureaucrats, should have the opportunity to direct certain federal investments in projects that are important to the district. That's part of our role, historically and constitutionally. So I think, again, there's bipartisan interest in returning them. There has been for several years. It's just neither side wanted to walk the plank by themselves and take the flak for it. But again, I think this is one of these things that, because of the safeguards we have in place, once we reinstitute them, and I think we will, over time, people won't even think twice about it. They'll actually applaud them, because so many important projects in my community and communities throughout the country will benefit.
Well, and do you think, again, with the earmarks, will it help to, or is it even possible to kind of put the genie back in the bottle with this, where earmarks can be used to kind of help bring the Congress back together, or make it a little bit more manageable, in the sense that, before, you had leadership could keep members in line and then actually be able to curry favor with members of the other party by being able to bring certain earmarks in or threaten to take certain earmarks out. Do you think that under the current climate that we're in, that's a tool that would be able to use to kind of bring us back to that type of order?
Yeah, David, there's no question about that. That's always been one of the positive impacts of earmarks, is that it encourages bipartisanship. And because you don't want to vote against a transportation bill that you might not otherwise like if you've got a $250 million project in your district. So, yeah, it's definitely been an enhancer of bipartisanship over the years.
I see.
Another question we have, I'll extrapolate sort of from it, but are you getting a sense that the SBA with its loan programs is doing a better job to focus on communities of color than perhaps the first round in the CARES Act?
That would be a very low bar, Sander. Yeah, I think, you know, what we've done in the bill we're talking about now, and the one we actually did earlier that didn't pass the Senate, was we actually have carve-outs for minority businesses, women-owned businesses, Black-owned businesses, so forth, so that money has to go to underserved populations and underbanked populations. So yeah, absolutely, without question. You know, I would never defend the Trump administration on much, but I will say that we threw a very difficult pitch at them back last April when we created the PPP program, and basically said, this is to sustain your payroll for 10 weeks and no guidelines, no rules. And they had, in a very short period of time, and since it was being administered through the banks, to create all of those rules and regulations and so forth. So it got off to a very, very inconsistent and sputtering start. Although I think most people who've looked at it said it really did help save a lot of businesses that otherwise wouldn't have made it. So, yeah.
Well, I can tell you, you know, with a lot of the nonprofit sector, those entities that were able to qualify for PPP, it benefited them as well. But one of the I guess the challenges that with that previous iteration of PPP was that initially when it was announced that the PPP would be available, it said you could borrow up to, I think, maybe $2 million. And then because of the demand that was generated for those loans, they then went back and shrunk it down and said, well, no, we only can do for $250,000.
Right.
Going forward, has that been addressed to where we're clear as to what the amount is that can be borrowed under those loans?
That's a great question, and I don't have the answer to it.
Okay.
I can get it for somebody, but I don't have the answer to it. By the way, I hate to do this, but we're in a vote right now, and there are only 52 people who haven't voted, and I'm one of them. So maybe if I can take one more question, and then I've got to run over to the floor and vote.
Right.
If Louisville and Kentucky play in the NCAA tournament, don't invite Tandy over to your house. I think we should wrap it up and let you go.
But if Vanderbilt gets in, he'd invite me.
That's right.
Well, let's wrap it up so you don't get in trouble there with your leadership. Thank you so much, Congressman. Great webinar. One of the best attended we've ever had.
Appreciate it.
Congressman, Mr. Chairman, we'd love to have you back again at another time whenever your schedule permits. Again, we thank you so much for your time and your service to our country.
Thanks, David. Yeah, anytime. I'd be happy to do it. Enjoy it.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. All right, and ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate you being able to participate on this webinar with us. What we try to do for you here at Dentons is to give you access to the men and women who are making those policy decisions in Washington, in our state capitals, and in city halls around the country. And we try to give it to you, as you've seen here today, in real time as it's happening. So please feel free to call upon us to help you and be a partner with you in addressing the different challenges and concerns that you may face or encounter as you run your respective organizations, whether it be a city government, a state government, a national organization, a local nonprofit, or a Fortune 5,000 company, or whether it be a startup mom and pop organization that's looking to grow to that next level. We're here to service you and to help you along the way. And so with that, Sander, if there's nothing else that you want to add right here, was there?
Well, no, I don't, and we don't want to hear you sing Old Kentucky Home either. Okay.
Well, that I don't think that's going to be happening anytime soon, and nobody wants to hear that as well. But we will say, if you do have any other questions that we weren't able to get to today because the chairman had to go and vote, please feel free to email us. You can email me at david.tandy@dentons.com, or you can email Sander Lurie at sander.lurie@dentons.com. And we'd be more than happy to get your questions answered, either from the chairman office directly or from one of our colleagues here within the firm. All right. And so with that being said, we wish everybody a great Thursday. Hope everybody stays happy and safe out there. And we look forward to seeing you again real soon. Everybody take care.
Thank you for joining us.